Hi guys, welcome back for week 8 of our Truth series, which is probably at this point in time going to turn out to be the final lesson in this series. I don't know, I haven't committed yet to getting to a defense of the resurrection. I may decide in 2 days that I'm going to do it, and I may wind up posting that next week. So if we do that, I'll alert you via social media and via email, and you'll find out and you can watch it next week. I just haven't gotten to that point yet where I've decided to do it. But if you've made it this far with us, I'm really excited about today's lesson. In writing about it and studying it, it's been one of my very favorites. And I want to give credit to guys like John Lennox, who's a mathematician at Oxford, and Ravi Zacharias and Tim Keller, and other guys who have really just had a profound influence on my life and the way I think about the Bible and the way I think about faith and reason. Today especially, I've leaned heavily on John Lennox, and you can Google him and you can YouTube him and find any number of things that you want to find out from John Lennox. He's a brilliant guy. So make sure you've got your notes in front of you, and let's dive right in. In 1966, Time magazine ran a cover asking the question, "Is God dead?" And that cover reflected the fact that many people had accepted the cultural narrative that God was essentially obsolete. That as scientific progress moves forward, there's less of a need for God to explain the universe. But what we really find out as time goes by is that science itself is perhaps the best source of our arguments for the existence of God. That same year the Time magazine article was run, astronomer Carl Sagan came out and announced that there were 2 necessary criteria for a planet to support life. The first was that you had to have the right kind of a star, like the sun. And the second was that you had to have a planet that was the right distance from that star. Well, given the roughly octillion planets in our universe, which is the number 1 followed by 24 zeros, there should have been about septillion planets capable of supporting life. That's 1 followed by 21 zeros. And with such spectacular odds, scientists were optimistic that the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which they called SETI, would find something in the near future. And so with a vast radio telescope network, scientists began listening for signals that would resemble coded intelligence. But as the years passed, the silence from the universe was what was deafening. Researchers had discovered exactly nothing. And as our universe knowledge, as our knowledge of the universe increased, it became clear that there were far more factors necessary to support life, much less intelligent life, than Sagan had initially supposed. His 2 parameters eventually grew to 10, and then those doubled to 20, and then made their way to 50, meaning the number of potentially life-supporting planets was decreasing with each passing year. Well, the number eventually dropped into the thousands, and then to a few thousand, and it kept plummeting, and even SETI proponents acknowledged this problem. Political scientist Peter Schenkel, in the magazine Skeptical Inquirer, wrote in 2006 this quote. He said, "In light of new findings and insights, we should quietly admit that the early estimates may no longer be tenable." Quietly, he says. Well, today there are over 200 parameters that are known for a planet to support life. And every one of them must be met perfectly, or the entire thing falls apart. For example, without a massive, gravity-rich planet like Earth, or like Jupiter rather, nearby to draw away asteroids, a planet like Earth would be more like an interstellar dartboard than the life-giving planet that it is. And so Jupiter has tremendous influence on our ability to be here living and breathing now. And that's just one of many, many criteria that makes life on Earth possible. I'll give you just a few examples, okay? Take, for instance, the neutron. The neutron is 1.0013784187 times heavier than the proton. If that were even slightly different, we wouldn't be living here at all. We would not exist. Now, I don't have time to go into all that and tell you why. You're just going to have to trust me. You can read about it if you'd like to find out. Take this, for example. The Earth tilts on its axis at 23.5 degrees. Why? Well, if the Earth didn't tilt, it would run the risk of one side getting stuck facing the sun at all times. And neither side would be able to sustain life. If the Earth's axis was 1% of 1 degree in either direction, you would either freeze or burn up depending on where you find yourself on the planet. Think about hydrogen. Hydrogen on Earth must convert 1/7,000th of its mass to helium continually for Earth to sustain life. If it's 0.007, it's perfect. If it's 0.008, there's no life on planet Earth. 0.006, there's also no life on planet Earth. Our atmosphere is 21% oxygen. If it was 22%, there would be no life on planet Earth. If it was 20%, there would be no life on planet Earth. Our oceans are 3.5% salt. If there was 4% salt in the oceans, there would be no life. If there was 2% salt in our oceans, there would be no life. This is what we call the science of fine-tuning. There are hundreds and hundreds of these kinds of numbers. There are carbon levels and gravitational force and density of minerals and elements, and they all add up just perfectly to sustain life on our planet. It's almost like there are hundreds and hundreds of tiny little dials, each one adjusted just perfectly to sustain life. And if even one of those was misdialed, if even one of those was just tweaked, it would render the accuracy of all the others irrelevant. What a mysterious place that we call home. I mean, the odds against life are astounding in our universe. Yet here we are, not only existing, but talking about existing. And what can account for it? Can every single one of those parameters have been met perfectly by accident? And at what point is it fair to admit that science itself seems to suggest that we can't be the result of random forces? More than that, doesn't assuming that an intelligence created these perfect conditions require far less faith than believing that a life-sustaining Earth just happened to beat the inconceivable odds? Well, consider this. The fine-tuning that's necessary for life to exist on a planet is nothing compared to the fine-tuning that's necessary for the universe to exist at all. Fred Hoyle, the astronomer who coined the term Big Bang, said that his atheism was greatly shaken by these developments. Even the late Christopher Hitchens conceded that the fine-tuning argument was the most powerful argument on the other side, or what we would call Christianity. John Lennox says, the more we get to know about our universe, the more the hypothesis that there is a creator gains credibility as the best explanation for why we are here. G.K. Chesterton says, it is absurd to complain that it is unthinkable for an unthinkable God to make everything out of nothing, and then to pretend that it is more thinkable that nothing should turn itself into everything. The greatest miracle of all time is the universe. It is the miracle of all miracles. I mean, it inescapably points to something or someone greater than itself. But if you believe that kind of thing today, you're very likely considered to be an imbecile. I mean, hasn't Christianity disproven God? That's a phrase or a question we often hear, if it's not made as a statement. No, science has already disproven God. And there are many loud and powerful voices that are giving credence to that idea today. Men like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Dan Dennett, who are extremely influential in spreading the idea that it's no longer intellectually credible to believe in God. Steven Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics, said, "The world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may in fact be our greatest contribution to civilization." And when people at that level of science say that they don't believe in God, and neither should we, well, the world takes notice. This is a huge topic. We could spend days on it. We could talk about old and new earth creationism. We could talk about evolution. We could talk about so many different facets of science and religion. And we've got to kind of try and sum it up here in about half an hour, which is obviously going to fall short. But at least we will introduce ourselves to the basics of the relationship between religion and science. Has science disproved Christianity? Well, you can guess that my answer is going to be no. Because the idea that science and faith are incompatible is really just a false premise. The question is not, does science conflict with belief in God? Because the tension is not between God and science. The tension is between worldviews. Consider that if you take the 100 years between 1900 and 2000, about 65% of Nobel Prize winners in physics were believers in God. Now that's a strong tradition of belief in God within the scientific community. In 2013, the Nobel Prize winner for physics was won by a Scotsman. His name was Peter Higgs. A few years before that, it was won by an American named William Phillips. And the difference between Higgs and Phillips is not their physics. The difference in them is that Higgs is an atheist while Williams is a Christian. They're not divided by their science. They're divided by their worldview. And the fact that you have Nobel Prize winners on both sides of this argument tells you that the conflict is not between science and religion. Because if it really were, you wouldn't have any Nobel Prize winners who were believers in God. They would all be atheists. We spent the entirety of week 2 in this series discussing worldviews. But for today's lesson, we're going to focus on the two most prominent when it comes to this discussion, those being naturalism and theism. Now, in naturalism, the universe is all that exists, while in theism, the universe is not all that exists. There's a God, a creator, who made the world and sustains it. In naturalism, ultimate reality is mass and energy. But in theism, ultimate reality is God, not the universe. For the naturalist, he looks at a universe and sees no evidence of God. But for theists, the universe does give us evidence of God. And people on both sides of the divide, naturalism and theism, are saying science is on our side. Richard Dawkins will tell you that science led him to his atheism. We would say the exact opposite, that science merely supports our belief in a transcendent. Now let's imagine that science is in between these two worldviews. To which one does it point? I mean, if it's true that faith in God and science are incompatible, science really would hardly have ever gotten started, because all of the pioneers of early modern science were believers in God. C.S. Lewis puts it perfectly when he says men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. And when we go back and we look through the lives of men who were foundational to the rise of science, we find men whose worldviews were grounded in the belief in a creator. For instance, Galileo said, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forgo their use." Johannes Kepler, who was one of the early brilliant astronomers of the 15th century, said, "The chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God, and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. And probably the most brilliant guy of them all, who was Isaac Newton, said this. He said, "Don't doubt the Creator, because it is inconceivable that accidents alone are the controller of the universe." When we study the early fathers of science, we find that far from being a hindrance to science, Christianity was the motor that drove it. And so we had Isaac Newton in the 17th century in Cambridge believing in God. And then we had Stephen Hawking, an atheist, in the 21st century in the same chair in Cambridge saying you can't believe in God, that you have to choose between science and God. Well, why does Hawking insist that we choose when Newton didn't? I mean, Newton gave us the law of gravity, right? And Hawking worked with gravity. He was working with black holes. But while Isaac Newton looked at gravity and believed in God, Hawking used it as a reason not to believe in God. Now that's fascinating to me. It's just amazing that two different guys looked at the same exact thing and came to completely opposite conclusions. How do we get from Newton's theism to Hawking's atheism? Well, it happens really because of three misunderstandings. False ideas about the nature of God, false ideas about the nature of scientific explanation, and then really false ideas about Christian faith. And so let's talk about each one of those. When we talk about false ideas concerning the nature of God, I think about a theory that we call the God of the Gaps theory, which is illustrated pretty well by this comic that I'm showing you now. In it, we have two scientists who are looking at two serious equations on a blackboard. And then in the middle, there's a gap where we read, "Then a miracle occurs." And one scientist is saying to the other, "I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. The idea here is that people will say, here's something that we can't explain, like something we found in the universe or in biology, and we can't explain it, therefore God did it, right? Like that's what we mean by God of the gaps, that he fills in all the gaps of understanding that science hasn't revealed to us yet. He fills in the gaps that I'm unable to explain scientifically. And that as we fill those gaps, as we close them, then we will expunge God from the picture because we will be able to explain what we didn't understand previously on the basis of science. But follow this now because it's really important. John Lennox tells us that if you define God to be the explanation for what science has not yet explained, then you have to choose between God and science as a matter of logic. So when you have Dawkins and Harris and Dennett and Hawking saying that you have to choose between science and God, the reason that they put it like that, the reason they say you have to choose is really because of an error in their concept about God. Their concept is that he's a placeholder who's just waiting to be removed as we understand more and more about the world and about our universe. But if that's how you define God, then of course you have to choose. It comes from your worldview. It comes from your definition of who God is. But the God of the Bible is not a God of gaps. The God of the Bible is the God of everything. We read in Genesis 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That phrase, that term is used to indicate everything that was created. We read it in the New Testament in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God from the beginning. And through him, everything was made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. And so there's a false idea that's driving this debate that you have to choose. A false idea about the nature of God. And people need to understand what we believe about the nature of God, that he made it all, that he's not just waiting around to be expunged when we fill another gap with new information, but he is the source of information and creation. Well, a second idea that I want to talk about is a false idea about the nature of scientific explanation. What do we mean by explanation? Like when we say that science explains something, what do we mean that it explains? Let me simplify that a little bit. Like, what does the law of gravity explain? John Lennox says, I can remember the day that it dawned on me that the law of gravity doesn't explain gravity. I mean, it gives us a brilliant way of doing mathematical calculations so that they're accurate. I mean, so accurate that they're able to land people on the moon. But the law of gravity doesn't tell you what gravity is. It merely explains gravity. The existence of the law is not a complete explanation, even within science. I think it's said best by a philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein. And he explains it in this wonderful way when he says, the great delusion of modernity is that the laws of nature explain the universe for us. The laws of nature describe the universe, they describe the regularities, but they explain nothing. Let me give you maybe a simpler example of what I'm talking about. If we were to look at a pot of water boiling on the stove, and we asked the question, why is the water boiling? We could say, well, it's boiling because heat energy is being applied as the water, and as the water reaches 100 degrees centigrade, the molecules are vibrating very fast, and they're beginning to throw off steam, and so on, and we could give you an explanation like that of why the water is boiling. But I can give you another explanation of why the water is boiling. The water is boiling because I want some tea. And that might seem overly simplistic to you, but the point is that those two statements do not conflict. One explanation is laws and mechanics, while the other is a personal or an agent explanation. I mean, they are simply different explanations for the same event. And God is not the same kind of explanation as science. Science gives us the mechanisms and the laws, but that's only one viewpoint. That's how it works. But God is an agent explanation. And so I need the laws and the mechanics to understand the boiling of the water, but I also need the personal impetus to boil the water. So God is that different type of explanation. Let's think about it another way. Suppose I drove a Ford Mustang under the church portico, and we all walked out there and we looked at it. And I tell you, I'm going to give you two explanations for the existence of this car. The first is the law of internal combustion in automobile engineering. And the second is Henry Ford. Will you please choose between one of the two? Well, it would be kind of absurd for you to have to choose one of those as an explanation for that Ford because they're both accurate. They're both explanations. Henry Ford does not compete or conflict with the law of internal combustion. He complements that explanation, doesn't he? And he's a different kind of explanation. And those two explanations don't threaten one another. And the interesting thing is that you need both of them to get a fuller explanation than you previously had with just one. Well, you won't find Henry Ford by studying his motor car, but his imprint is all over it. You won't find him, but his imprint is there. And scientists today are presenting us with the universe, and they are saying, here are two options, naturalism and theism. Choose one. But it's really just a false premise. It's a false war. God is not competing with the law of gravity or the laws of quantum mechanics or the standard model of physics. God is the reason why there are explanations at all. He's a creator who causes it to be. He's a different kind of explanation. And so we need to explore the notion that there is warfare between science and faith that really isn't warfare at all. It's simply demonstrably false. It's just due to false understandings about God's nature and about the scientific explanation. It's really a worldview conflict involving two fundamentally opposed explanations of ultimate reality. When Isaac Newton got his law of gravity, he didn't say, well, I've got the law of gravity now, I don't need God. Not at all. He understood more about his universe, and then he was able to better worship God who created the universe in that way. He was able to better understand the nature of God who created the universe in that way. And the more I understand about engineering, the more I can admire space shuttles. And the more I understand art, the more I can admire the genius of somebody like Rembrandt, right? And the more I understand the universe, the more I can admire the God who created the universe to be this way. It all depends on your worldview. I mean, Christopher Hitchens, the atheist who wrote the book, God is Not Great. At 21 years of age, he was called by the sheriff's office to ID his mother, who had committed suicide with a defrocked priest. I mean, what's a kid like that going to think about religion? There's not a battle between science and God. There are only battles among worldviews. And there's one more catalyst that's driving this war between faith and science that I want to quickly mention on today, and that's a false understanding about Christian faith. Atheists have done a clever job of describing faith as, or defining faith as, believing where you know there's no evidence. But see, faith is essential to science as well. Every scientist must believe before they do any science that this world is rationally intelligible. I mean, what's happened in our culture is that people have relegated faith to this religious sphere as blind faith. But I trust my faith in the idea that the universe can be logically understood, that it's not blind. Let me say that again. The universe has to be rationally intelligible for me to do science and trust it. And so I have faith that the earth is rationally intelligible and that the universe is rationally intelligible. My faith that is in Christ is not blind. It's really based on evidence. And you can see that. And you say, well, what evidence is that based on? Well, John, at the end of his gospel, says this. He says, many other signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, John is saying, here is evidence that what I'm saying is true. Here's evidence that what I'm presenting to you is valid. I mean, if Christianity were not evidence-based, then we might as well go ahead and get rid of the entire New Testament because it claims to be evidence. And so we need to be very clear what we mean by faith. And we also need to remember that faith is being taught in every university in this country. It's just not faith in God. And we need to give up the use of faith as exclusively a religious term and put it back where it belongs. Well, author and scientist and really brilliant thinker David Berlinski is an agnostic. He's a secular Jew and really has no dog in the fight because he's not a follower, of course, of any religion. And after he read Dawkins's The God Delusion, Berlinski took up pen and paper to write his response to the God Delusion. And it reads thusly: has anyone provided a proof of God's inexistence? Not even close. Has quantum cosmology explained the emergence of the universe or why it is here? Not even close. Have the sciences explained why our universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for the existence of life? Not even close. Are physicists and biologists willing to believe in anything so long as it is not religious thought? Close enough. Has rationalism in moral thought provided us with an understanding of what is good, what is right, and what is moral? Not close enough. Has secularism in the terrible 20th century been a force for good? Not even close to being close. Is there a narrow and oppressive orthodoxy of thought and opinion within the sciences? Close enough. Does anything in the sciences or in their philosophy justify the claim that religious belief is irrational? Not even in the ballpark. Is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Dead on. Now that's Berlinski. He's not trying to make an argument for any religion. He said that when sciences move into this terrain with the autocracy and the arrogance of a single scientific vision for all reality, that they're moving beyond the purview of science and becoming very, very scientific at that point. Hasn't science disproven God? Not even in the slightest. Science is a necessary enterprise, and it's able to get us to many mountains that we can climb and summit and find answers to myriad questions, but it cannot answer the eternal questions of life, like love and purpose and meaning. Sir Peter Medawar, who also won the Nobel Prize, said, "The existence of a limit to science is made clear by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions, having to do with first and last things, questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? And what is the point of living?" Well, I hope some of that has made sense to you. I especially like considering scientific explanation and the idea that there are just different explanations to the things that atheists would have us believe can only be naturalistic, that they believe can only be scientific. Author Peter Jastrow, who wrote a book called God and the Astronomers, sums it up in this way. He says, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountain of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." There is no war between God and science. It was God who created science. The two are absolutely compatible. Not only that, they're intertwined. They're tied together throughout all of history. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you down the road. God bless.